When I was a kid, I used to sit on the roof of the barn in my backyard, staring up at the stars and wondering what else was out there, wondering what the meaning of life was. Like many others, I had an unwavering belief that what I did in life, what actions I took, inherently had meaning. I believed that the world would open up for me, and this idealism was the pillar on which I lived my life. I tried hard in school, I excelled in my extracurriculars, and I tried to be the model son. I didn't drink or do drugs, I didn't party, and I chose friends that fit that mold as well. But in the back of my mind, I always had an anxiety, one that I couldn't really place, I couldn't figure out. Despite trying to do everything correctly, I always felt like I was missing something. Like no matter what I did, it would never be enough. It wasn't until I discovered nihilism a few years later that I understood where that feeling came from. As someone who wasn't religious, I believed that there wasn't a heaven or hell, but I never went so far as to think there was nothing at all. As I read more about the philosophy, the gears turned in my head. That anxiety that I felt was my mind reminding me of my own mortality. It was a painful, gut-wrenching reminder that no matter what I did, none of it really mattered. Because one day, I would die, and the world would continue on without me, as if I had never existed at all, just the same as it had before I was born. This week's episode is going to be a little different from the norm. We're shifting our focus briefly for an examination of the meaning of life, or rather, the meaninglessness of life. Nihilism is a contentious philosophy, because it relies on the individual to choose what to do with it. If left unchecked, nihilism can result in anarchy. If nothing matters, then I can be as cruel or merciless as I want to. On the other hand, the realization that nothing matters, that there isn't some cosmic purpose, can be quite liberating, and can lead an individual to define their own meaning. But first, I think we need to take a step back and look at the roots of this philosophy, because it'll help us take a closer look at our world today. So what exactly does nihilism mean? Unfortunately, the answer isn't simple, because there are many forms of nihilism, and each of them differ in key ways. But at the core of the philosophy is a very simple idea. Life is meaningless. Now let's just take that simple phrase and extrapolate it to a scenario. Let's imagine you're driving down the highway. You aren't paying attention and you attempt to merge into a lane that already contains another vehicle. In the other vehicle is a man who has been down on his luck for the last few months. His marriage is crumbling. His job is looking less stable than it used to, and he is filled with regret. As you merge into his lane, he taps on his horn to let you know that he's there, but you take it as a form of aggression. You swerve back into your own lane and flick the man off as he passes you. This was the straw that broke the camel's back for him. He doesn't know why, but he suddenly realized that his life isn't worth living anymore. Nobody loves him and the world is cruel. Later that night, he takes his own life. At face value, the action of flicking that man off seems fairly meaningful. It results in the loss of life. That man's candle went out and will never be lit again. But to a nihilist, that action is meaningless, and so too is the man's suicide. This is because everything, all of existence, is meaningless to a nihilist. Nihilists realize that an action's meaning is defined by how it affects humans, but that frame of reference is flawed. If you zoom out far enough, both in space and in time, all actions have negligible effects on the universe, if any at all. Critics of nihilism would say that it's the culmination of a complete breakdown in moral values. The philosophy is most commonly attributed to Friedrich Nietzsche, who examined the topic in its relation to the decline in Christian values and the rise of decadence in the mid-1800s. And indeed, the correlation makes sense. For thousands of years, society's moral compass was dictated by what the religious experts had to say. In the 1600s, Western society began to diverge from Christianity. John Locke was writing about the separation of church and state. Religious movements were breaking away from mainstream Catholicism. By the 1800s, This transformation was in full swing as the rise of atheism was nearing unstoppable speeds. Many leading thinkers, including Andrew Carnegie, Karl Marx, and Nietzsche himself, were staunch atheists. And with these changes at the individual level, society was changing as well. People's minds were starting to break free from the constraints of religious dogma, but that was a double-edged sword. While it opened people's minds to new concepts, it also left many without a clear path to morality. Throughout the 19th century, the nihilists clashed with those in power. Because they believed the universe to be without meaning, they rejected the idea of a soul, and thus clashed with the church. They also questioned the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which was used to keep the people from questioning why royalty deserved all the wealth while the poor toiled. In this way, they clashed with the established order of the monarchy. Nihilism in the 1800s was much more of a political movement against the established order than a true moral crisis. That would change in the 20th century, when nihilism would shift to be much more existential in nature. Throughout the century, socio-political upheavals battered the psyche of Europe and the United States. 2 world wars ravaged Europe, a Great Depression and a Cold War. These intense experiences caused a major shift in the way that the people thought about their lives and the idea of life after death. People were confronted by political decisions that their leaders made that ran contrary to the values that their societies were supposed to uphold. Americans were told that their country valued freedom and democracy, yet they saw their government occupy Vietnam and topple regimes around the world in the name of political expediency and economic dominance. At the same time as all of these atrocities were occurring around the world, the Western countries also saw one of the largest increases in standard of living in history. The American dream promised that everyone could own their own home and a vehicle. Everyone could go on vacation, send their children to a good school, and retire to a beautiful beach upon turning 65 years old. Europe was in a similar situation. Yet despite these amazing achievements, the struggle that many around the world had experienced cast a large moral shadow. People were living in effectively 2 worlds at once, a world in which their own personal lives were better than ever, while at the same time, others suffered. This dichotomy made people question the existence of a God that would allow such atrocities to occur. If there was no God, then what awaited them after they died? The populations descended into nihilism. What choice did they have? They could either continue to believe that there is moral and objective truth, or they could recognize the absurdity of existence. At least by choosing to live with the absurd, they could let go of the problems that they had no control over. Then, the 21st century came, and with it, the world was shocked by conflict, and a new generation grew up with an even keener sense of the absurdity of it all. They saw the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression in 2008. They saw rising tensions between the world's superpowers, the US, China, and Russia. They saw the effects that the 20th century decadence had on the environment, as the production of consumer goods pumped out tons of greenhouse gas emissions that are now warming the planet faster than ever. So how does a generation cope with these issues that we are so painfully surrounded by? Easy. We make memes to make ourselves feel better. We laugh in the face of the absurdity. We live lavishly, choosing to spend our money on the latest iPhone, knowing full well that the factories in China where they are produced are some of the biggest contributors to global climate change. We travel to remote portions of the world to get a glimpse, if only for a moment, of what the world looks like when it is untouched by humanity's influence, knowing all the while that our very presence in those locations undermines the reason that they're worth traveling to in the first place. We live in a dichotomy. We try to fill our lives with meaning, while at the same time recognizing that life is meaningless. We have descended into nihilism. We've entered into an age of fairly pessimistic nihilism, but it doesn't have to be that way. Instead, we can focus on a more optimistic view of nothingness. If life is inherently meaningless and devoid of objective truth, then we get to define the values and principles of our own lives. Instead of choosing to descend into materialism, we can choose to live more simply, to be conscious of where we get our goods from and how we treat our neighbors. We can choose to focus on building our communities and raising one another up, instead of focusing on all the problems that we cannot solve alone. In this way, we can find our zen. We can take solace in the emptiness of our existence and that it is free from cosmic judgment. There is a philosophy that seeks to attain nothingness. Some may call it a religion. This philosophy talks about a path that one must follow in order to obtain nirvana, and this path was first walked by the Buddha around 500 BC. Nirvana is described as a place of nothingness, non-possession, and non-attachment. Unlike nihilism, where nothingness is seen as a lack of meaning, Buddhism changes the emphasis of the word. Instead of nothingness, it becomes no-thingness. This indicates that if we let go of our worldly possessions, if we detach from materialism, we can start to achieve a higher understanding of our universe. I'm not implying that I think everyone should start to practice Buddhism. Rather, I seek to show that we can change our lives by simply changing our perspective. We can take an optimistic view of nihilism and respect that while life may be devoid of objective meaning, we can still define meaning for ourselves. I want to leave you with one last thought about nihilism and how it relates to business. In my opinion, business is either optimistically nihilistic or anti-nihilistic in nature. Businesses thrive because they solve problems in the world. And while there are some businesses that exist solely to make money, most are started because they want to improve lives. The founders realize that they hold the means to improve the objective experience of countless others. If the founders had a pessimistic view of the world, if they thought that their actions were devoid of meaning, then they'd never pursue the act of helping others. Either they are anti-nihilistic and think their cosmic purpose is to improve lives through their actions, or they are optimistically nihilistic, in that they realize that they have to choose how to create their own meaning. Whichever it is, it's commendable, because the act of creating something from nothing changes the world, and in that way, it has meaning. Hey guys, thanks for listening to the show. I know it was a bit different this week, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to smash that like button and the subscribe button. And while you're at it, please share our video with a friend. Thanks a lot.